This video is going to cover debugging fundamentals, and we are going to cover debugging in a IDE, so against Node.js and executing against the console, as well as debugging inside of the browser using Chrome Developer Tools. So let's go ahead and begin by creating ourselves a project. As usual, it's Tim under my devs folder in the repository where I'm keeping all of these practice, and then 08, and we are doing debugging fundamentals. Go ahead and select that folder as our project root. And then let's go ahead and add ourselves a JavaScript file. Debugging fundamentals.js. All right, so debugging is pretty simple when we are using Visual Studio Code. And we're going to go ahead and run through debugging against Node.js, so executing against the local development environment using Node. And then we're going to cover debugging in the Chrome Developer Tools. So let's start out with debugging just against the Node.js, or executing a JavaScript file locally. So let's give ourselves some code. So let first name equal, let's do Bob. Oops. Let's do let last name equals Smith. And then let's do like an if statement. If first name equals Fred. And we're going to do something here. Let's do console.log first name Fred is awesome. Because if it's Fred, it's going to be Fred. And let's copy that line of code just to keep it simple. And let's do else, and then let's do amazing. All right, so we know if it's awesome, their name was Fred. If it's amazing, it was something completely different. And I'm just coming up with some arbitrary code just so we can show how we debug using Visual Studio Code against Node.js, and then we'll get into the browser. So here, we've got a whole debug system right here for running JavaScript code against Node.js on your local machine. So hopefully you've got Node.js installed right now. If not, you should find the video that shows you how to go through installing Node.js and setting it up. Once that's installed, you should be able to get through this debugging video without a problem. So we're going to go ahead, and the best way to debug code is to look for a line of code where you think a problem is happening or might be happening, and then placing what we call a debug point or a debug marker or a breakpoint. There's a bunch of different names for it, but you can set a breakpoint right on the line of code where you would like the execution environment to stop in its execution. Now the cool thing about debugging is when you are debugging, the execution environment will stop right there at the breakpoint, and over here it will provide us all of the information about the current environment as it sits when we hit that breakpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. So debug, start debugging, and we'll see it hits this breakpoint. It highlights that line so we know exactly what line we're on. And the cool thing here is that it shows us all of the local variables that are put into the JavaScript execution environment and are available right here on this line. So if we look at it, we've got the this object, we've got our exports, we've got a module, we've got our require. These are all provided to us by Node.js execution environment. So let's not worry about those right now. Let's talk about these two right here. We've got Bob as our first name and last name. So these are variables that we created earlier in the code, and we get to see what the value of those are right here at this line. This right here is a step over. So if you want to step over a particular block of code, you click it and it'll step over that line of execution to the next line. Now in this case, we're using an if statement. It turns out that if first name equals Fred, which currently the value is Bob, as we see right here, doesn't equal, so it didn't come in here. Instead, it moved to the else, which makes this the next line of code. So the debugger actually stops at the next viable line of code that is ready for execution. And with that explanation, you see that the console.log is the next viable line of code for execution. We'll see that we still have access to all of the local variables that are happening in this execution environment. And right now we should see that Bob plus is amazing. So this string should be combined with the string Bob, and we should have the output Bob is amazing. So if we go ahead and step over, we'll see that Bob is amazing and went to the final line of the file. And we can go ahead and click play in order to just go ahead and finish execution. Let's run through that again, and it should stop there again. We can also stop the debugging right here, and we can also start over our debugging. We also have a step out of, so if we get into a block of code, we can also step back out of it, and then we can step deep into a block of code using the step into. All right. So let's go ahead and stop the debugging because we don't need to finish it. And let's do something where if the first name is Fred, let's do something crazy, and this makes no sense, but it allows us to see how variables change. Let's change the first name to, so it was Fred. Let's change it to a familiar form and just say Freddy, because we know Freddy. All right. So let's go ahead and execute it. Start debugging. All right. So we see that the first name is Bob, and then we step over it because it's not Bob. This does not execute. This executes. So let's go ahead and click play. Now let's change this to Fred, and we should now be able to get into this block. So let's go ahead and F5 to start the debugger. All right. So first name is Fred. Now we're going to do the comparison. When we do this step over, we end up at the next line because these were equivalent in the if statement. We now end up with this. We're going to convert the name from Fred to Freddy because we're familiar with Freddy. And now we should see that Freddy changed. And you'll see that inside of the variable window, inside of the debugger, this is now highlighted, the first name Freddy. And that is because the value of the variable first name has actually changed since it was first assigned. It was first assigned up here to Fred when it was first initialized, and Smith has stayed the same, so it isn't highlighted. The cool thing is that it shows you when a variable's value changes. So if you're expecting, as you're going through your code, that a variable's value never changes and you're experiencing a crazy bug, if you come look through your list of variables and if you see any of them highlighted, you have a variable that actually changed, which means you might need to go back through your code and look for a statement where that variable's value was changed or updated or altered, and then figure out why that happened if it wasn't expected. An easy way to figure out that there was an error or that unexpected results have happened from your code. So this is debugging right here. This is debugging against Node.js where you're executing a JavaScript file locally. So let's go ahead and click play on that. We should see Freddy is awesome because that variable is updated. It all worked great. So now what we're going to do is we are going to work on how we handle this inside of the browser. So how do we debug in the browser? So let's go back to our window here, back to our project directory listing. Let's go ahead and add ourselves an HTML file. So index.html. And then inside of our HTML, let's go ahead and give ourselves a doc type HTML. Give ourselves the root HTML. Let's give ourselves a head. And let's do a title. And let's do debugging. And then we'll need ourselves a body. And then inside the body, we can do an H1, and we'll just call this debugging fundamentals. All right, and then at the end of our body, we're going to go ahead and add ourselves a script tag, and our source is going to be our debugging fundamentals. And that'll give us a script. And now we can go ahead and view this particular HTML document in our browser. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it inside of our Chrome browser. And then we're going to go ahead and open up our debugging tools. So if you go over here to the three dots and you go to more tools, and then you do developer tools, you should see your developer tools open up. I'm going to leave it mostly to our developer tools, most of the screen that is, and we're going to keep it on console. And I'm going to go ahead and go to default, and we're going to reload it. All right. Now, if we go to sources, we should be able to look in here and look at the sources that we have. Now this browser sync right here, this was injected by the tool that we're using to run this page locally against a local web server in the Visual Studio Code. If you don't have that plugin installed, let's go ahead and look at our extensions. So you're going to want to install this one right here. It's Preview on Web Server. All you do is go to your extensions, search for that extension, and then install it. And once you have that extension installed, you should be able to go to your HTML file, right click, and you'll have this right here, and then choose Preview in Web Server. That'll launch it in the web server, and now you've got a locally running web server on localhost at 8080, and you'll see all of this. And it injects its own little script, and that script right there, what it does is it allows this web page to be hot reloaded as we make changes down here. All right, so we've got ourselves our debugging fundamentals script right here, but if we look, you'll notice that script is nowhere to be found. So let's check this out. Our index.html is at the root of our website, and then we've got our debugging fundamentals.js file. And if we notice, it's just not finding that file. So let's work on debugging that. If you notice, it was because I had my script as a self-closing tag when I should have had it as a full tag with a full closing tag. Once I made that change, you'll see that this now loads, and you'll see the JavaScript file right here. So now that we've got an HTML page with the JavaScript fundamentals running, cool thing is that we can pull up here to our console, and we're going to need to be able to get this file to run. So what we're going to do in order to have that happen is we are going to actually wrap all of this code right here in a function. So we're going to say function test. We're just going to call it test. And we're going to place all of this code inside of that function. And inside of our index.html, we are going to go ahead and, based on the onClick event, we're going to go ahead and we are going to call this function right here, test. Okay, so now when we click on our index right here, this code is going to execute, and then we're going to see this output right here. So let's refresh it, no output. Let's go ahead and click on it, and now we've got Freddy is awesome. So we know our code is now executing in the browser, and now we want to go ahead and debug it. So let's debug. So this is very, very similar to what we did when we're executing against Node.js against the local environment running just the JavaScript file. We can add debug points or break points just like this. It looks a little different. It's a blue arrow. It shows you which line it's going to break on. And then when we go ahead and click Debugging Fundamentals, you will see the page goes gray because it's in the middle of executing. We've got a play and we've got a step over. And we've also got them over here. We've got a play, we've got a step over, which means go to the next call. We've got a step in, we've got a step out, and then we've got just a regular step. And then of course we can go ahead and deactivate all the breakpoints and we can pause execution, or we can just go ahead and click play to continue execution. So right here, we're just going to step like we did in the last one. So first name is Freddie. As you can see right here, you can see everything that's happening inside of your script right here when we stop at this line of code. And we can look at our locals. So these are the same as those variables. So we got window. We can look at our script and see the variables that we have here for the script. And as we saw, we created the first name and last name. We can see them right here with their values. And then we can see all of the global variables that are given to us by the browser. As you can see, there's a lot more global variables provided to us by the browser as well as global objects. So in order to keep this easy, we're just going to go ahead and most of the time you're going to work with local and you're going to work with the script variables. So we're going to go ahead and step over again. We should see Freddie change. Unlike in Visual Studio Code, the variables are not highlighted when they change. So that's something you're just going to have to look for closely when you run into a bug and values might be changing based on what you're doing and it might be unexpected. So here we see that Freddie changed, or Fred changed to Freddie, and then we can do it again and we've got our Freddie is awesome. So just like browsing, or just like debugging in our IDE, we can debug in the browser the exact same way to try to figure out what's happening in our code. So that is the basics of debugging. There's a lot more to debugging, a lot more complex methodologies and skills, as well as a ton of stuff you need to learn about debugging. But for where you are right now, these are the fundamentals. This should help you a ton in debugging both local code that you are executing on Node, as well as code in the browser using breakpoints. And let's go ahead and let's make sure, as always, that we open up a open up a terminal or a command prompt, and then make sure we get to our repository and upload all of our code. So again, ls or dir will show you all of your files. We're going to go to my dev folder, and then we're going to go to Neumont Studios, which is the repository. We're going to git status. Debugging Fundamentals project hasn't been added, so we're going to do a git add and stage those files for commit. If we do a git status, we can see what has been staged. Git commit -m to add a message, and we've got screencast 8 debugging project added. Now they have been committed to our local repository. We can see that it hasn't been pushed to our remote repository. Enter in my credentials for my remote repository. Let it get pushed. Check again with git status. We see everything's good to go, and our code is safe.